Recording.
Bro. Afternoon, everyone. By way of introduction, this is Trieste and Ella, and we are going to be talking to you about anti-racism today from the perspective of two Black women who both exist in a predominantly white society. We thought we would begin with a famous image to frame this discussion, one that for us really represents what anti-racism is about from a number of different angles. This image depicts US athletes Tommie Smith and John Carlos raising their black gloved fists at the 1968 Olympics, the height of the civil rights era, to highlight the pervasive injustices against Black people in America. Peter Norman of Australia finished second in the race and took the podium with them. Tommie and John and many of their Black teammates almost boycotted the games altogether that year, which would have been significant given that many of the best athletes on the US team were Black. All three athletes were in some way making symbolic statements through various items of clothing and the Olympic Project for Human Rights badges they were wearing at the time. But it's this powerful image of John and Tommie's raised fists signifying Black power, Black unity, that becomes infamous.
So this image actually encapsulates a couple of really fundamental elements of anti-racism work. The first one is just bravery. Anti-racism takes a lot of guts. So the two Black men in this image were suspended after this. They were dropped from the US Olympic team. They were booed on the podium. They were derided at the time. And the mainstream sporting community essentially shunned them. But they chose to make this statement in solidarity with suffering Black people in the US and around the world at great personal sacrifice. And the second thing that I'd like to call out here is white allyship. So it's important to note that Peter Norman did play a part in this, the white guy on the podium. His participation in this statement is less known than the other two men, but he not only wore his badge in solidarity with the cause, but it was he who suggested that they wear one glove each, as they both planned on bringing gloves to the ceremony, and John Carlos had forgotten to bring his pair. So Peter was part of this in his own way, mostly through behind the scenes support in helping them get their message across. And I think this is a really great demonstration of white allyship. He supported and elevated Black voices without necessarily feeling the need to center himself in the conversation. And it's worth noting that he also suffered greatly for his support, and he wasn't treated particularly well when he returned to Australia. Next slide, please. Okay. So before we really get into the meat of the content today, we just wanted to set some boundaries and to make some very clear points about the purpose of this presentation. So firstly, this is the beginning of a frank conversation started and led by two individuals. And it's important that you understand that the Black experience is not monolithic. Each experience is different from the next, and Trieste and I are speaking on behalf of ourselves, our experiences, and our learnings. The two of us actually have a lot in common. We are two Black women who are second and third generation Jamaican immigrants. We're both mixed race to varying degrees. We both have Windrush generation grandparents who came to Britain in the 1950s and 60s. And so we don't speak for all Black people, or indeed all people of color, which is why it's really important that you consume a diverse range of Black literature, art, film, education, etc. And this is just the start of a conversation. So after this, it's all of our responsibility to educate ourselves, to self-reflect, and to take action on our newfound knowledge. We work at a company that's given us a great foundation to start. So the list provided by Naomi is a really great place to start from. And finally, I would just call out that as Black women, it's really incredibly difficult for us to even talk about racism, and especially in the workplace. So what we say is always heavily considered, moderated, and often softened for fear of being labeled as aggressive, angry Black women. So today we're going to try and do our best to be brave and to speak unequivocally, especially because this topic is of huge personal significance to both of us. and it has a tangible daily impact on our lives and the lives of the people that we love. Next slide.
We also want to be very clear about what this session isn't. So again, we're not speaking on behalf of an entire community of individuals. It's important to understand that any lived experience you hear about or read about, you don't take them as being the experience of all. And we're actually going to touch on this later on in our presentation. Secondly, this is not a training session. So to be really clear here, anti-racism training is a professional service run by experts who have the specific aim of breaking down institutional racism within the workplace. It's an investment companies should be making to ensure we truly have a diverse and inclusive workplace. Thirdly, this isn't the beginning and end of your education. This is the start of a long overdue conversation. And lastly, we ask that after this hour, you don't bombard your Black colleagues, family or friends, or just any Black people that you know with requests for reading lists, websites, videos, etc. These resources have been readily available and easy to find for years, and it really is your responsibility to go and find them yourself first. Oops. Sorry, Ella.
Right. Okay, so you're probably going to feel challenged today, and you might even feel defensive in this session. That's good. It's perfectly natural. It's going to be challenging to find out, for instance, if you're a white person, you are inevitably benefiting from and upholding racist systems, however unintentional. This is happening whether you like it or not, whether or not you're a good person, and whether or not you have Black friends. So we acknowledge that sometimes discomfort arises from education, because with education comes more realization, and with more realization comes a responsibility to take action. So the writer Scott Wood said of racism is an insidious cultural disease. It is so insidious that it doesn't care if you're a white person who likes Black people. It is going to find a way to infect how you deal with people who don't look like you. It is a set of socioeconomic traps and cultural values that are fired up every time we interact with the world. It is a thing you have to keep scooping out the boat of your life to keep from drowning in it. I know it's hard work, but it's the price you pay for owning everything. So here's our ask of you today. Please be present, please give us your full attention, and please challenge yourself to self-reflect and sit with your discomfort. If during the session or in conversation with people of color, or while you're otherwise educating yourself on racism, you feel the need to defend, stop, take a moment, sit in this feeling and ask yourself why you feel like this. Ask why a person speaking their truth can sometimes feel like a personal attack. Ask how society's narrow definition of racism has created the conditions in which speaking about its existence is so fraught and uncomfortable. This is how we start to begin to dismantle systemic racism. And this is where our growth in this area really starts. It's going to be hard. And this moment has been a long time coming. So ask yourself if you're now ready to do the work. Next slide, please.
So have you ever found yourself in a conversation in which you've been pulled up on the racist undertones of a comment you've made? Think about what your response was at the time. I've been in this situation countless times, like so many others, in which I found myself having to point out why someone's comment or viewpoint is inherently racist, only to be met with the reasoning that I've either misunderstood what was said, or that said person didn't mean to be racist, and so I shouldn't really be offended. Now, not only is this exhausting for me, to then have to explain to someone why, regardless of the intention, their comment or viewpoint is harmful to me, it also represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the ways in which systemic racism impacts absolutely everything from the macro to the micro. We need to question the idea that racism means X person did something intentionally racist, and so X person is a bad person. And we need to start understanding racism as a system of power that we exist in and are either the beneficiaries of or the victim of. Systemic racism is embedded into the fabric of our society, right down to the language we use and the unconscious biases we hold. So, what role does white supremacy play in this? How do you visualize white supremacy in society? For me, growing up, when I thought about white supremacy, I envisioned your typical EDL football hooligans shouting racist abuse at the black football players or attacking innocent bystanders. For those of you not aware, the English Defence League are a far-right group based in the UK. I'd actually put them towards the top of the triangle that you're looking at right now. I remember throughout my childhood, my dad sharing stories of how he and his friends would end up in physical fights with these groups on multiple occasions after they had attempted another unprovoked attack on them. My parents, like so many others, were fighting against some of the most extreme examples of overt racism and white supremacy. And when you are fighting against this, while you know it exists, the more insidious forms of white supremacy can sometimes come secondary because you are literally trying to make sure you can survive and create a safer and fairer world for the generation that follows you. So, when I was growing up, these were the extremes I was looking out for. But as I started to educate myself, in addition to listening to my parents' lived experiences, I realized that white supremacy comes in multiple forms and is insidious in its ability to hide behind a claim of ignorance, a quick deflection, or just complete indifference. So when looking for a definition of what white supremacy is, if you do a quick Google search, you'll find something similar to the following definition. The belief, theory, or doctrine that white people are inherently superior to people from all other racial and ethnic backgrounds, especially black people, and are therefore rightfully dominant, the rightful dominant group in society. While accurate in the context of the belief, the problem I find with definitions like this is that it perpetuates the idea that you have to intentionally think this to contribute to its existence, but that isn't true. White supremacy is a system of oppression that our society is built on. It is there to silence minorities either through actual intentional violence or, more commonly, through the countless microaggressions Black people are forced to navigate on a daily basis. Some of the quotes you can see on the slide you're looking at right now are good examples of microaggressions that help to silence minorities and solidify the subconscious paradigm that to be white is to be superior. To be frank, the reason white supremacy is so deeply ingrained is because it forms the building blocks of our society that enriched itself greatly from the enslavement of Black people. In order to justify this barbarity, laws such as the Barbados Slave Code, of which similar versions were later implemented across the world, were enshrined in law the idea of whiteness as superior and Black people as property. Countries such as the UK and America became prosperous through this. So lawmakers wove the concept of Black inferiority into society in ways we're still trying to unpick today. For me, one of the clearest examples of white supremacy is the fact that it took a 9-minute long video of an innocent Black man slowly dying for this to truly open up this conversation. George Floyd was one person of the literally thousands who have been murdered over the years. The Black Lives Matter movement was founded 7 years ago in response to systemic racism and police brutality. Along with the NAACP in 1909, the Civil Rights Movement in 1955, the Black Panthers in 1966, and countless other movements. This is not a recent phenomenon. So with the aforementioned in mind, can we still claim to not be racist? And is this actually a helpful claim? I'm now going to play a 6-minute clip of Robin DiAngelo explaining why this claim is problematic on so many levels. And just side note, let me know if you can't hear it. Whoops.
Spoiler.
Spoiler alert.
All systems of oppression are highly adaptive, and they can adapt to challenges and incorporate them. They can allow for exceptions. And I think the most effective adaptation of the system of racism to the challenges of the civil rights movement was to reduce a racist to a very simple formula. A racist is an individual, always an individual, not a system, who consciously does not like people based on race, must be conscious, and who intentionally seeks to be mean to them. Individual conscious intent. And if that is my definition of a racist, then your suggestion that anything I've said or done is racist or has a racist impact, I'm going to hear that as you just said I was a bad person. You just put me over there in that category. And most of my bias anyway is unconscious. So I'm not intending, I'm not aware. So now I'm going to need to defend my moral character. And I will, and we've all seen it. It seems to be virtually impossible based on that definition for the average white person to look deeply at their socialization, to look at the inevitability of internalizing racist biases, developing racist patterns, and having investments in the system of racism, which is pretty comfortable for us and serves us really well. I think that definition of a racist, that either or, what I call the good bad binary, is the root of virtually all white defensiveness on this topic, because it makes it virtually impossible to talk to the average white person about the inevitable absorption of a racist worldview that we get by being literally swimming in racist water. So let me connect that to myself. As a result of being raised as a white person in this society, I have a racist worldview. I have deep racist biases. I have developed racist patterns, and I have investments in the system of racism because it's served me really well. It's comfortable. It's helped me overcome the barriers that I do face. And I also have an investment in not seeing any of that for what it would suggest to me about my identity and what it would require of me, right? I didn't choose any of that. I don't feel guilty about it. It is an inevitable result of being raised in this society in which racism is the bedrock. The question of guilt comes in what am I doing about that? While we who are white tend to be fragile in that it doesn't take much to upset us around race, the impact of our response is not fragile at all. It's a kind of weaponized defensiveness, weaponized hurt feelings, right? And it functions really, really effectively to repel the challenge. You know, as a white person, I move through the world racially comfortable virtually 24/7. It is exceptional for me to be outside of my racial comfort zone. And most of my life, I've been warned not to go outside my racial comfort zone. And so on the rare occasion when I am uncomfortable racially, it's a kind of throwing off of my racial equilibrium. And I need to get back into that. And so I will do whatever it takes to repel the challenge and get back into it. And in that way, I think white fragility functions as a kind of white racial bullying, to be frank. We make it so miserable for people of color to talk to us about our inevitable and often unaware racist patterns that we cannot help develop from being socialized into a culture in which racism is the bedrock and the foundation. We make it so miserable for them to talk to us about it that most of the time they don't. Right? And we just have to understand that most people of color that are working or living in primarily white environments take home way more daily slights and hurts and insults than they bother talking to us about, because their experience is they're going to risk more punishment. They're going to lose the relationship. They're going to have their experience minimized, explained away. They're going to cause the person to feel attacked or hurt. And in that way, white fragility functions as a kind of everyday white racial control. None of that has to be intentional or conscious, but that is how it functions. And it's actually incredibly liberating and transformative to start from the premise that, of course, I've internalized all of this. And then I can stop defending, deflecting, denying, hoping you won't notice, minimizing, explaining. And I can just let go of that and get to work. And there's a question that's never failed me in my efforts to unpack. How do we pull this off? How do so many of us who are white individually feel so free of racism? And yet we live in a society that is so profoundly separate and unequal by race. And the question that's never failed me is not, is this true or is this false? Is this right or is this wrong? But how does it function? How do these narratives that I tell, how do they function? When I tell you, well, I'm just an individual, why can't we all just be individuals? When I tell you, I was taught to treat everyone the same. When I tell you, but it's focusing on race that divides us. When I tell you, but I have lots of friends of color. Those narratives have not changed our outcome, and they function to take race off the table and to exempt the person from any further engagement. And in doing that, they function to protect the current racial hierarchy and the white position within it. It doesn't have to be what I'm intending to do, but it is the impact of those narratives.
Muted myself, didn't I? So as she pointed out so eloquently in that video, one of the reasons that oppressive systems are able to flourish is through a misrepresentation of what racism really is, how it manifests itself, and how it sustains itself. If this kind of image, this hateful image of the Ku Klux Klan, is the only manifestation of racism, then we can't talk about any other form. So this is really what the top of the pyramid is that Trieste showed us earlier. So actually, I think it's important that we start to think of anti-racism as a series of actions that we can take to dismantle racism, brick by brick, an ongoing, dedicated commitment to create a more equitable society, rather than a quest to be free from racism and therefore one of the good people. Racism is the air we breathe. None of us are free from it. We are interacting with it constantly and unconsciously. So giving ourselves a pat on the back for being a good person or not a racist is really not what anti-racism is about. And in fact, I would say that that's dangerous, because that attitude absolves us of any real responsibility to take action. So according to the historian Howard Zinn, to be neutral, to be passive in a situation is to collaborate with whatever's going on. So if we all we are is not racist, and we think of that as enough, we actually collude with racism as a system of power, and we actually accept it as the status quo. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd just say something quickly about Martin Luther King, because when we talk about neutrality and passivity in the racist struggle, some people, incorrectly in my opinion, tend to cite Martin Luther King as this peace-loving, moderate man who, if only he were alive today, would absolutely take issue with some of the methods of protesters at the moment who are letting down the cause by rioting or engaging in violence or whatever. In fact, it was Martin Luther King who said, "The riot is the language of the unheard." So I think it's important that we remember too that figures like him, and by the way, he was one of the most hated men in America when he was assassinated, were actually thought of as radical in their time, and how widely criticized their actions were at the time. So actually, Martin Luther King was a huge believer in direct action, which is a form of anti-racism work. And he also bemoaned what he referred to as the white moderate, which is sort of the type of ally who passively agrees with the cause but does nothing, or worse, criticizes from the sidelines the actions of those who are in the fight. So I'd actually just like to read some words from his letter from Birmingham jail, because I actually think that they're just as relevant to the modern anti-racism struggle as they were back then. I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Next slide, please. So, what is anti-racism? It's pretty simple, actually. So just as Grace pointed out last week when she did her talk on LGBT plus allyship, I would describe anti-racism as a verb, not a noun. It's something we show through our actions. It's not something we are as an identity. So the good news is that we really don't have to be free from racism to be an anti-racist. There's no requirement of perfection, and there's no destination of moral purity that we can hope to get to. As Ibram X. Kendi has pointed out, a racist or anti-racism is not who we are, but what we are doing in the moment. The flip side of this is that anti-racism work can sometimes feel daunting. If racism is everywhere, if it's the water that we're swimming in, then it can feel like simply too big of a problem for us mere mortals to tackle. So being an anti-racist requires constant practice, patience, commitment. It's a daily exercise in self-awareness, in self-criticism, in self-examination. But it's also important that we move past the seeming enormity of the task and realize what a huge collective difference that all of our individual actions can take. Thinking of ourselves as too insignificant to enact real change leads to inaction. And inaction is racism's best friend. Oppressive systems thrive on our inaction. So it's really important that we all start taking responsibility through our daily actions. And the first step in taking responsibility is recognizing our privilege. Next slide, please.
So if racism is an insidious cultural disease that is infecting how we deal with one another constantly, anti-racism not only requires an action-led approach, but an incredibly perceptive one too. If racism isn't simply about individuals in the Klan or the EDL who are actively and obviously hateful, then we have to really start to tune in to the nuances of it. And white privilege is one of those nuances. The difficulty with privilege of any kind is that to the beneficiary, it's invisible. So, for example, when I'm not stopped and searched for being suspicious looking, how can I recognize the presence of my privilege in that moment? It's almost impossible, because what I have experienced is comfort, the ability to go about my day untroubled, the absence of harassment. Only through tapping into and learning about the experience of others and how different, sorry, let me start again. Only through tapping into and learning about the experience of others and how they differ can I begin to understand the presence of my privilege. Only when I compare my own experiences to the experiences of, for instance, Windrush immigrants who were asked to come to the UK as Commonwealth citizens to rebuild this country after the war, and then were met with racism at the time, and now continue to be demeaned and even deported by the Home Office, having lived here for most of their lives. Or the experience of Black communities, in particular young Black men who live with regular police harassment and the assumption of their criminality. Or the experience of Black women who are dismissed and stereotyped in the workplace consistently. Only when I compare the relative comfort of my daily existence to these experiences can I begin to see what is otherwise invisible to me. So here's an example of exactly what we're talking about. This man articulates the essence of the white privilege that exists in American society. It's only when he realizes that his fate might have been different had he been a Black man that the story he sometimes tells at parties is given a new comparative meaning. So to be clear, this white man may have had a difficult life. He may have experienced hardship. What we mean when we say white privilege is that his race has not been one of the contributing factors to his hardships in his life. He can walk down the street and not be criminalized or assumed guilty or murdered in an interaction with law enforcement because he's white. But what about my opinion on immigration laws being too lenient? What about the off-color jokes I like to tell in the privacy of my own home? I have the freedom of speech. I'm entitled to my opinion, right? Okay, so let's take a look at that. In an interview with The Guardian, when asked, what do you see as the biggest challenge to progress? Reni Edulodge began with the following answer. The opposition to anti-racism is masked in passive-aggressive politeness. We live in a country that tries to pride itself on fair play, but is really resistant to any attempt to analyze what that fair play actually looks like. It's a faux politeness that is really invested in the proper way to do things rather than justice. So this answer really resonated with my experiences struggling to discuss racism with white people. So for example, I had a conversation with a white person about why comparing Serena Williams to an animal is in essence a racist view. And I was actually met with the following response. Well, I have a right to my opinion and I'm allowed to voice that. And that was the end of the conversation. We are in a society that values white opinions, white lives, white perspectives over and above anyone else. And so of course that person I was speaking to felt entirely justified in shutting me up by stating that she has the right to her opinion. But when we talk about the right to an opinion, what does that really mean when you weaponize this statement to silence minorities who are trying to voice their lived experiences? What we are really talking about here is the right to an opinion without challenge. This is a privilege afforded only to those who are part of the dominant group. And so as a result, my existence, my experiences are reduced to a conversation drenched in unconscious bias and racism. And I have no space to challenge this because your opinion is justified because it's your opinion. That is privilege. When you end a conversation with "I have a right to my opinion," you essentially slam the door shut to any narratives that contradict your viewpoint. How can we progress if you continue to do this? The exclusion of minorities isn't just limited to debates on the nature of our existence and lived experiences. This is also prevalent in the ideologies we hold around the notion of beauty. So if you think about the images of beauty that are promoted in the media, we can see a common theme throughout: lighter skin, straighter hair, more European features. when Black women have the rare opportunity to appear on the front covers of the likes of Vogue, it's often those who have a closer proximity, to whiteness who are given these opportunities. But to be clear, there's absolutely nothing wrong with these women themselves. What is wrong is the way in which the media uses this aesthetic to promote one limited idea of beauty as the norm, making anything outside of this othered. So we see this ideal trickle down into our everyday interactions. So for instance, your Black colleague who might turn up to work one day with the hair in braids and the next day with their natural hair out might then be, the comments made throughout the day from their non-Black colleagues perpetuate the idea that anything that deviates from the perceived white norm is something to be commented on freely, and it further alienates that Black colleague, reinforcing the fact that their existence is othered. So again, this is something that I've also experienced. The fascination with my hair has prompted many to say the following: wow, how do you have such nice hair when you're so dark? Oh, so do you go to a specialist to get your hair cut? To which I always reply, no, I just go to someone who knows how to cut hair. Or, oh my God, your hair. I've actually never seen anything like this. Can I touch it? As said person already has their hands in my hair. So apart from feeling embarrassed and alienated when people are so comfortable in pointing out that I'm different, I also feel enraged that people have the audacity to make these comments and expect me not to respond with anything but a polite yes. For some of us, we don't fit into the limiting narrative of what society believes we should look like as human beings. That limiting narrative legitimizes those racist microaggressions because we don't fit into the norm. And so we're outsiders to be poked, prodded, and fetishized. So the only way we can start to break down these destructive narratives and actions is to begin to listen, to reflect, to learn, and to really take action.
So we really need white voices in the anti-racism struggle, and we absolutely require allyship from white people in order to be able to dismantle the white supremacist power structures that we live in, that we've been talking about. We do want to take some time, however, to discuss how and when potentially well-meaning allyship can cross over into the problematic. So performative allyship is allyship that is specifically designed to be a good PR opportunity for the person who is performing. Often, this is in the form of social media posts, and often these come at a time when it is safe and expected to do so. It's sort of a form of self-interested, good person virtue signaling, often not accompanied by actual real-life commitments or daily actions. So it's a brand changing their logo to the rainbow flag during Pride Month, but having a terrible track record on LGBT rights. It's L'Oréal Paris who were quick to jump on the PR opportunity of posting about Black Lives Matter, but who in 2017 were also quick to drop Monroe Bergdorf, a Black trans model, from their groundbreaking campaign when she spoke out about systemic racism. It's the group Lady Antebellum, this one really gets me, changing their name to Lady A, because they've only just now realized that the word antebellum has clear associations with slavery, but then choosing to sue the Black woman blues singer who's been using the name Lady A for over 20 years. So, deep breath. I'm going to tell you a quick personal story to illuminate this. I have a friend, let's call her Sarah. She was quick to post on Instagram during Blackout Tuesday a few weeks ago to, in her words, amplify melanated voices, and posted lots of videos from Black activists about how white people can and should be better allies in their daily lives. At Sarah's recent birthday, her boyfriend, let's call him Tim, had been quite proud to discuss with me his political affiliations. In his own words, he's a far-right political supporter. Now, bear in mind that this man is fully aware that he is conversing with an out-the-closet gay Black woman. At the time, I expressed how upset this conversation had made me, how appalled I was, and hardly anybody in the room supported me, Sarah included. In fact, I was deemed to be causing an argument and bringing up politics. So when I viewed Sarah's Instagram post that Tuesday a few weeks ago, I decided to say something. I sent her a quick DM saying that I was really happy she was posting and drawing attention to these important issues, but at the same time, passivity and gaslighting that's being called out by the Black activists in the videos she was posting was actually akin to how I was treated at her birthday. She'd had an opportunity to stand in allyship with me and chose not to. In fact, she'd known of his private views long before the altercation, and she chose both publicly and privately to accept them. I said that I was trying to commit to challenging friends more on these issues, and I hope she would be open to listening. Next slide, please. Here is Sarah's response. So at the same time that she sent this response, she was also chose to share my phone number with her boyfriend without my permission. And he proceeded to message me incessantly for about an hour or two on WhatsApp, on Instagram, on various different platforms, insisting that I take a phone call with him to, in his words, clear up the confusion. So what exactly is wrong with all of this? Well, as you can see from the red pen that I have gone wild with, pretty much everything. But let's break it down. So first thing she does in this message is abdicate responsibility. My message was to call her out as my friend, to reflect on what she was posting in light of real life events, how she's handled them, how she's responded to them in the moment, choices she's made, and ways in which she's been complicit. In the first line of this response, she takes an immediate decision not to personally engage or self-reflect. She sees this as between me and Tim, nothing to do with her. Second, let's be clear, there is no confusion. I don't need to know what Tim meant. I know what he said. His statement was clear, and I remember it exactly. He told me to my face that he supports a political agenda which actively seeks to curtail my rights as a Black gay woman, and framing my response as confused is gaslighting. This kind of minimization and prioritization of apparent intention over impact actually sits near the bottom of the pyramid that we showed earlier. It's one of the more socially accepted forms of racism. Black people are tired of being the only person in the room or at the party to call out racism, and it's not our job to defend ourselves when we do call people out, nor to feel gaslighted because maybe a clear statement was apparently misinterpreted or we didn't really understand what you meant. Thirdly, his comfort and hers is centered and prioritized above everything else. They need me to speak to them so that they can feel better. She shared my number with him without my consent so that he could hassle me. And to what end? So that he could defend himself? So that he could debate with me about what he meant? Who exactly would that have served, me or him? As a Black person, it's traumatizing to engage with so much constant news about Black people being murdered because of their Blackness, to watch video after video of people who look like you and your brothers and your sisters and your uncles being killed by those who are supposed to protect them whilst they plead for their life. And then to see people on our timelines performing their allyship online, but not doing the work to call it out with their family members and boyfriends and friends when we need them to in real life. Next slide. So we've spoken about the dangers of passivity, and we've also spoken about the trap of performative allyship. There's another well-known trap worth mentioning, and I would say that this is arguably a form of performative allyship, and that is the white savior. Now, this is an important point in the presentation to check in with your discomfort, because it would be easy at this juncture perhaps to think, well, we're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. Firstly, we told you of the dangers of doing nothing. Now we're telling you not to do it wrong. Bear with us though, because we think that the how of anti-racism is incredibly important. It's not the good person Olympics. And if your motivations are ultimately selfish, you are still centering yourself and your vanity over the real work of dismantling racist systems, and you could be doing more harm than good. The white savior wants to help. What could possibly be wrong with that? Well, Whilst the concept of helping can be positive, it also allows us to fall into the trap of thinking of racism as the struggle of Black people and minorities, something that white people can magnanimously dip into and lend a helping hand with now and again. So it's really important that we reframe the struggle for equality as everyone's struggle. White supremacy is everyone's enemy, just like it's everyone's responsibility to dismantle patriarchal systems of power, not just women's. It's everyone's responsibility to dismantle white supremacist systems of power. So anti-racism can't be a hobby or a fair weather project. In fact, as a beneficiary of the current power structures, it's actually incumbent on white people in particular to use their privilege to dismantle them. This is really important because misunderstanding whose problem racism is and who can fix it misplaces the burden of responsibility to solving it onto the disadvantaged group. These lines can often appear subtle, but they are significant. The idea of saving Black people from their plight and giving them a better life is inherently paternalistic. And these ideas, in fact, have their roots in our colonial past. So, perhaps ironically, the white savior and the colonial figure are in fact inextricably linked. Both want to help, save, civilize Black and Indigenous communities who apparently don't know any better. And both, in their own ways, further a dangerous narrative about white superiority. Next slide, please.
So Ella has taken us through some of the traps you may find yourself falling into when trying to contribute positively to the cause. It's also important to understand the crucial role that intersectionality plays in our experiences with racism and discrimination. It's important to understand that the experience of one person doesn't equal the experience of all. This is why we emphasize at the start of the presentation that our words are on behalf of ourselves as individuals. So like, for instance, I myself as a straight Black woman, for example, cannot and should not speak on behalf of Black trans people because my lived experiences are different. In fact, it's my responsibility to do exactly what we've asked you all to do today, which is listen without judgment, educate myself, and use my knowledge to loudly take action. So while the interconnecting aspects of identity have always affected the way in which Black people experience racism, it was Kimberly Crenshaw who coined the term intersectionality as a way to help her explain the multifaceted forms in which racism and oppression impact marginalized groups. So for example, rather than things like race, gender, or sexuality being completely separate aspects of a person, they actually overlap and contribute to that individual's unique experiences with racism and discrimination in society. So if you attended Grace's talk on LGBTQ+ allyship, you will have heard her talk about a documentary called Disclosure, which is a series of interviews with trans and non-binary people voicing their experiences and interaction with media representation of their community. Firstly, I thought this documentary was a brilliant example of how you can truly open up a space for marginalized communities to voice their lived experiences without commentary from others who aren't part of that community. But this documentary is also a very good example of why we must understand the interconnected nature of race, gender, sexuality, and so much more. So, for example, I don't know how it feels to have your existence minimized to something that is openly laughed at. I don't know how it feels to be disowned by my family because of who I am. And so I can't speak on behalf of these people, and I shouldn't. So what has been said today needs to be understood as one experience out of a multitude of different but related experiences that Black people have endured. Listening and learning from a multitude of lived experiences and understanding those experiences to be different but intertwined and just as important as the next is when you really start to understand what being anti-racist means.
So, what can you do? This isn't an exhaustive list, but firstly, we've spoken about it a lot educate yourself, read about privilege, read about histories of race, but also read more diverse stories in general. Not all Black people just write about racism. Read novels as well as nonfiction from a diverse range of voices. There are lots of multi-dimensional stories worth reading.
Take part in activism. Activism takes multiple forms. You can donate to a worthy cause. You can lend your time to anti-racist movements. You can attend protests. You can also write to your local MP on key issues.
One of the biggest things you can do might feel like a small thing, but it actually has a huge impact. Become extra perceptive about your privilege. Use it for good. That can mean noticing when your Black coworker gets talked over in meetings. It can be using your privilege to call it out and amplify their voice. It can mean pushing an anti-racism agenda if in some of the all-white spaces you exist in, if you do. It can also mean recognizing that the ability to say, let's not talk about politics, is a privilege in and of itself. Remember that Black and minority people don't have a choice. My entire existence is political. There is no door that I can leave my identity at.
Also, speak to your family members. Speak to your friends. Be that person who calls out racist banter at parties. Be the person who refuses to accept that your uncle, your dad, or your granddad is a bit racist and that's okay for them to get away with. Be that person that speaks out.
And listen to Black people and people of color when they share their experiences. Really listen without judgment or defensiveness and commit to doing better. Anti-racism is a muscle and we have to keep working it constantly. We recognize that this is hard. You will absolutely mess up along the way. The important thing is to keep trying, keep pushing, and keep learning, because the absolute worst thing we can do is nothing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? I think we've got 5 or so minutes.
That was great. Thanks, guys. That was really powerful, actually. I just had a question. I know that Trieste, at the beginning, you mentioned that, of course, this is not an official class, but there's actually, is it consultants that come into companies and kind of look at the organization and infrastructure? Is that something that Receipt Bank is looking into at the moment? Or
yeah, I'll take this. So in essence, yes. So there's a few things that are being done. First thing is that we've obviously started to assemble a team of diversity champions, people who've put their hand up and said that they want to be a part of making change happen. Secondly, from that sort of bigger group, because the good news is we had loads of people who wanted to be a part of it, we'll have about 10 people, almost like sort of like the social committee, who get together and are pushing change as a sort of smaller group. And Naomi's going to push those changes at SMT level. And sort of within that, these will be things that are up for discussion in that group. But as a specific answer to your question, yes, we are looking at that. And we're looking at who we might bring in to come and talk to us. You know, Trieste and I have got our personal experiences, but we're not experts in this.
cool, thanks.
Thanks, Max.
I have a question. I'm quite interested in the what was spoken about by Ella and partially Trieste as well about gaslighting, because I think that is almost like a technique almost of how to tell the other person, oh sorry, I think you've misunderstood, but also sort of like denying their version of events and what they're experiencing isn't the right thing. I think that's one of the examples of where it can come across as very, very subtle. And I think your example, Ella, is one of them. But can you share maybe other examples of where it may seem less obvious, perhaps? It doesn't have to be necessarily just from yourselves, but other examples that you've seen that may resonate with other people more as well.
So I don't know if you've got some ideas, Trieste, but I think that I think of this, the example that I shared, as quite an extreme example in a way, but I think that throughout my life, it's sort of been, it may not be something necessarily personal to me, but it's a sense that if you point anything out, whether that's, oh, we never see any adverts with Black families in them, or actually, if you look up a program on Netflix, if it's a Black family, they have to state that it's a Black family, because that's part of the message of the it's not, it can't just be a family who happen to be Black. If you point out these things that are seemingly subtle, often I think it's met with, you're overreacting, that's ridiculous, nobody intends that, etc. So I think it's those kinds of times where I find it the most difficult to say something. You know, I was talking to a friend the other day about the fact that the ugly duckling is Black. And normally, or in my experience, whenever I've pointed out something like that to a white person, they're like, oh, come on. And those are the ways in which I think you can be pushed down. And I think it's important, this thing that we spoke about of intent versus impact. You might not be thinking about that overtly when you create something where you make the ugly duckling Black, but that doesn't mean that that's not how it's felt. You know, and this kind of conversations happens even in extreme scenarios, like with Trump. You know, there's a lot of coverage of Trump in American news that is, but is he racist in his heart? It doesn't matter if he's racist in his heart. If he's doing racist stuff, then he is racist. And I think that's what I would say on that one.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think it also comes out, the examples that I've had in my friends' personal lives and my life is often the mispronunciation of names. And I've got friends who, you know, will often turn up to interviews and the person at the front desk can barely be bothered to pronounce their name, let alone just ask how to pronounce. And, you know, I've had things like, oh, like, can I just call you something else? It's much easier to do that. And whenever I point out the racial undertones there, a lot of the time it's, sorry, your name is genuinely quite confusing. I think you're looking into this too much. Like, I think you're being a bit sensitive. And it's you know, it's very subtle, to the point where, like, I've been in conversations with people where I've actually convinced myself that I'm the one in the wrong. But as Ella said, like, I think it doesn't actually matter what the intention is. The fact is that it was done. And that's how, you know, that person on the receiving end kind of feels.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you. Any more? I think we're sort of at time, but if people have any more questions, I'm happy to answer them. No?
Okay.
I think we're good. We're off 4 o'clock on the dot.
On the dot.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Yeah, cheers, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, guys.